Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. The sound of heels against marble echoed urgently through the grand lobby of the Whitmore Hotel, one of Manhattan's most exclusive venues. Ava Bennett rushed inside, her heart racing faster than her steps. She was late, ridiculously late, for the wedding of her best friend, Lila, and, of course, her phone had just died. The elevator was out of service. Of course, it was. With no time to waste, Ava grabbed the skirt of her pale blue dress and darted for the staircase, whispering apologies to no one and everyone as she climbed. Her curls bounced wildly around her face, and her breath caught with every flight, makeup barely holding up, dignity definitely losing it, but she didn't care. Lila had always been there for her in every heartbreak, deadline, and sleepless night of architecture school. Ava wouldn't miss her big day, not even if her cheap cab had broken down halfway through Fifth Avenue. She was halfway up the last set of stairs when it happened. Turning a corner too fast, she collided into a solid wall of expensive fabric. No, not a wall, a man. He was tall, unmovably tall, and as she stumbled back, her heel caught the edge of a step and slipped. But before the fall could complete, strong hands grasped her waist and pulled her upright in one swift motion. Her face landed inches from his chest, where the scent of fresh pine and something darker, sandalwood, invaded her senses. Her breath hitched again, but for a completely different reason now. I'm so sorry, she blurted, stepping back quickly. Her eyes shot upward, and her words stopped cold. The man was handsome wasn't the right word. He was striking. Like someone who didn't belong in real life. Dark, well-groomed hair, intense blue eyes under furrowed brows, and a jawline so sharp it could have been carved by a sculptor. He looked like the kind of man who'd never been late for anything in his life, the kind who didn't trip, the kind who expected the world to make way. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the chaos dissolved into silence. "You okay?" His voice was low, smooth, and laced with a hint of curiosity, not annoyance, as she expected. Ava nodded too quickly. Yes, thank you. I just stairs, rushing, wrong turn." She stopped. She was rambling. He tilted his head slightly, not looking away. "You always make entrances like that?" There was a slight curve at the edge of his mouth. It wasn't a full smile, but it was close enough to one that it made her stomach twist. Ava looked away, cheeks blazing. "Only on very special occasions," she muttered, brushing invisible dust from her dress and trying to recover any scrap of composure. She tried to move past him, her hand gripping the railing, but he stepped slightly aside without taking his eyes off her, as if unsure whether to let her go just yet. "You're late," he said, not as a judgment, but as an observation. She blinked. "You noticed?" He finally gave her a small, amused smile. Hard not to. Ava exhaled, partly from nerves, partly from relief. Then, without another word, she hurried up the last few steps, not daring to look back. She didn't even hear him walk away. The ceremony had already begun when she slipped quietly into the back row of the grand ballroom. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the sea of pastel gowns and dark tuxedos. All eyes were on the altar, where Lila stood radiant beside her groom. Ava took a deep breath. She'd made it, but as she settled in and tried to focus on the vows, a tingling sensation crept over her, like someone was watching her. She looked to her right. No one. To her left. Still nothing. Then, as subtly as she could, she glanced toward the front rows, and her heart skipped. There he was, the man from the stairwell, seated beside the groom, in a tailored black suit that fit him like it was made for no one else. His hand rested casually over one knee, but his gaze was fixed on her, not in an obvious way, not leering or rude, but in a calm, deliberate way, like he was studying her, and he wasn't in a rush to look away. Ava turned forward quickly, her cheeks heating again. Who was he? She leaned toward the woman next to her and whispered, "Hey, do you know who that is sitting next to the groom?" The woman arched a brow. "You mean Ethan Carter?" Ava swallowed. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "Should I know him?" "You don't?" The woman said, clearly surprised. "He's the CEO of Carter International, one of the most powerful men in New York, practically a ghost in public, though never gives interviews, never seen with anyone. They say he's brilliant, but cold as ice." Ava looked forward again, her heartbeat uncomfortably loud in her ears. Ethan Carter. Of course, she'd heard the name. He was in the business news all the time, ruthless, elusive. Not exactly the kind of man who exchanged glances with late, clumsy women at weddings. Yet, here she was, and he was still watching her. A strange awareness settled into her chest. A quiet kind of tension she couldn't explain. She tried to brush it off, to focus on Lila's voice as she said her vows, but Ethan's presence filled the space between them like static in the air. When the crowd stood for the final blessing, Ava felt his eyes again. When they clapped for the newlyweds, she dared a glance his way. He was still looking, still, and when he finally stood and turned his head to speak to someone beside him, Ava exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. She didn't believe in love at first sight, but something had just shifted, something she couldn't name, and somehow, she knew this wasn't the last time she'd see Ethan Carter. The ceremony should have been the kind of moment Ava loved, elegant, graceful, full of soft light and whispered emotions. The violinist played a delicate melody that floated through the air like a promise. Roses lined the aisle in creamy white and dusty pink, their scent mixing gently with the warmth of sunlight through the high-arched windows. Everything was perfect, except her mind wasn't here. Not really. Ever since she'd taken her seat, Ava had tried to focus on Lila, on the vows, on the moment, but the awareness wouldn't leave her. That feeling, that pull, was stronger now. Like a string had been tied between her and the man sitting 3 rows ahead. Invisible yet undeniably real. Ethan Carter. Now she had a name to put to the storm. He hadn't looked back again, not directly, but that didn't matter. Ava could feel his attention like heat on her skin. Even when she wasn't looking, his presence pressed against her sharp, focused, unrelenting. She tried to ignore it, to keep her breathing steady, to fold her hands in her lap, and stay still like everyone else. But her heart was betraying her. Every time the pastor said love, it seemed louder. Every time the guests laughed softly, she was the only one not smiling. And every time the sunlight touched her bare shoulders, it felt like fingers tracing her skin. Except it wasn't the sun she was thinking of, it was him. And that terrified her. What was wrong with her? She'd met the man for less than a minute. It had been clumsy, awkward, even ridiculous. Yet, something in his gaze had unsettled everything she thought she knew about herself. No man had ever looked at her like that, not with arrogance or desire, but with curiosity, as if he wanted to figure her out, as if she was a puzzle, only he had the right to solve. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress, grounding herself. She didn't like this, didn't want this. She was here for Lila, for joy, not this strange, magnetic dance with someone like Ethan Carter. The man didn't even smile fully. That half-curve of his mouth was the most expression she'd seen, and yet, her body reacted like it was standing too close to a fire. Focus, Ava, focus. The ceremony continued, and finally, the couple exchanged rings. Lila's voice trembled with emotion, and Ava blinked hard to hold back tears, not from romance, but from the confusion rising inside her. The applause rose as the couple kissed, and guests stood in a wave of celebration. Ava clapped too, mechanically, trying to look as though she was present. But as the newlyweds walked back down the aisle, arm in arm, and radiant with joy, Ava felt a shift, movement in her peripheral vision. She didn't want to look, but she did. He was standing tall, poised, completely composed, talking quietly with the best man, laughing even, barely, but enough to show that he was fully at ease in the world he belonged to. And then he turned his head, not all the way, just enough. Their eyes met again. It wasn't a long look, barely a second, but it was deliberate. Ava inhaled sharply and looked away, biting the inside of her cheek to stop her mind from spiraling. Her skin prickled with the awareness that she had become visible to someone who usually never noticed anyone, someone who wasn't supposed to see her. She was just the bridesmaid, late, flustered, ordinary. He was him. And yet, the silence between their glances carried something heavier than the violins, something she couldn't describe, like a conversation they hadn't had, like a tension building for a story that hadn't even begun. The guests began moving toward the reception hall. Ava stood, smoothing her dress, and followed the crowd with slow, unsure steps. Her thoughts raced in every direction, her breath shallow and her chest tight. She reached for her small clutch and checked her reflection in a mirror along the hallway. Her curls were a little wild, her lipstick slightly faded. She looked like someone who'd barely made it to the ceremony on time. but there was a flush on her cheeks that hadn't been there earlier, a glow in her eyes that betrayed her inner unrest. "Get a grip," she told herself. It was just a look, one glance, maybe two. It didn't mean anything. Men like Ethan Carter didn't just notice women like her, especially not with so many socialites and heiresses in the room. Still, she had seen it, felt it, the quiet pause when he saw her, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, like she had interrupted something in his world, and instead of being annoyed, he'd been intrigued. The reception hall opened into a luxurious ballroom, lit by golden chandeliers and the soft clink of glasses. Waiters floated past with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. The guests filled the space with laughter and chatter, their voices echoing off the marble. Ava spotted Lila and made her way over. The bride looked stunning and euphoric. "You made it," Lila beamed, throwing her arms around Ava. "I was beginning to panic." Ava laughed softly, burying her chaos behind the smile. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." "You okay?" Lila asked, pulling back. "You seem off." "Ava hesitated. Just flustered." "Long story." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Does this story involve a tall, dark-haired man staring at you like you're the only person in the room?" Ava blinked. "What?" Lila leaned in, grinning. "Don't look now, but Ethan Carter hasn't taken his eyes off you since the staircase." Ava's mouth opened, then closed. "You saw that?" "I saw enough, and so did he, apparently." Ava's pulse fluttered. Lila squeezed her arm gently. "Be careful. He's complicated. I'm not interested." Ava lied. Lila just gave her a knowing smile. "Of course, you're not." Ava laughed nervously, excused herself, and went to find some air. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up a glass of champagne. She didn't drink it. Instead, she stared into the bubbles, trying to figure out what this all meant. Why him? Why now? And why did part of her hope he'd speak to her again? Even as she stood in a ballroom full of people, surrounded by light and love and laughter, she felt like something darker, something quieter, was moving just beneath the surface, and it was coming straight toward her. The reception had reached that golden hour, when the laughter turned warmer, the speeches became more honest, and the champagne flowed just enough to blur the edges of anxiety. Candlelight flickered across the grand ballroom's mirrored walls, casting soft shadows that danced to the rhythm of the music. Ava stood near the edge of the room, carefully avoiding both the dance floor and the bar. She'd spoken to Lila, fulfilled her bridesmaid duties, smiled through conversations with strangers, but now her nerves buzzed like electricity beneath her skin. Ethan Carter hadn't approached her, not yet, but he was still there, still watching. She felt it every time she moved, every step she took, every breath she tried to hide. His gaze followed like a silent shadow, not aggressive, not overt, just present, and that was somehow worse. She didn't like being seen like this, unguarded, messy, late, flustered, but she also couldn't stop replaying the way he'd caught her on the staircase, the way he hadn't laughed or judged or dismissed her. Instead, he'd looked at her like a man who didn't want to look away. Ava told herself she wouldn't seek him out. She told herself she was in control, but her feet betrayed her. She moved toward the bar, needing space, needing distance from the thoughts circling her head. She reached the counter and ordered a glass of white wine, dry, crisp, familiar. But as she turned with her drink in hand, she collided into someone's shoulder. Again, the splash was immediate. Crimson liquid bloomed across a black suit like a blooming rose. Ava froze. "Oh my God." The man looked down. Of course, it was him. Ethan Carter stood before her, his perfectly tailored suit now decorated in Merlot. He blinked once, slowly, then raised his eyes to hers. For a second, time fractured. Ava's heart plummeted. I'm so sorry," she stammered, reaching for a napkin. "I wasn't looking." Ethan tilted his head, the ghost of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Do you always make entrances like this? Or is this just a wedding thing?" Ava blinked, then let out a short, breathy laugh. "Apparently, I have a gift for disaster." He accepted the napkin she handed him, but made no move to clean the stain. Instead, he looked at her over the rim of his glass. "I was hoping we'd speak again." That caught her off guard. "You were?" she asked, more defensive than she intended. He nodded. "Most people don't crash into me. Fewer still walk away without apologizing profusely." "I did apologize," she countered. He smirked briefly. "But you fled before I could say anything else." Ava felt a mix of annoyance and curiosity flare. "Maybe I didn't think there was anything else to say." "There's always something else," he said smoothly, then gestured toward an empty stool. "Care to sit? You owe me a conversation." "I owe you dry cleaning." He arched a brow. "I can afford new suits." What I can't buy is good company. Ava narrowed her eyes but sat, carefully. That's a dangerously charming line for a man who's apparently cold as ice. Ethan let out a soft laugh. It was low, genuine, and rare. Ah, so you've heard the rumors. They're hard to miss, especially when everyone whispers them like you're a ghost that might hear. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bar. And what do you believe? Ava took a sip of her wine before answering. I believe most powerful men are far more human than they want to admit. Ethan didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression. His gaze deepened. And what about you? He asked quietly. What are you hiding behind that clever mouth and runaway clumsiness? Ava blinked. She hadn't expected the question to turn so personal so quickly. I'm not hiding, she said carefully. I'm just not used to being interrogated by men in $1,000 suits. He chuckled again. That's fair. There was a pause, a quiet one, but not empty. The noise of the party faded behind them. It was as if, in that small space between their bar stools, a different room had formed one, with no music, no laughter, just them, and the tension humming softly between every word. Architecture, she said suddenly. That's what I do. I'm not just a bridesmaid with no last name. Ethan nodded. Ava Bennett, born in Boston, moved here 6 years ago, graduated Columbia with top honors. Currently designing the Richmond Tower for Horizon Architecture. Ava stared at him. You Googled me. He met her gaze evenly. No, I read the investor files. She blinked. Wait, he gave her a slow, deliberate nod. That's not possible, she whispered. The lead investor in Richmond Tower is me. Ava set her glass down carefully, her pulse rising. You already knew who I was. Back at the staircase. No, Ethan said, his voice soft. I didn't. Not then, but I wanted to. Ava was quiet for a moment. She didn't know whether to be flattered or furious. I don't know what you're trying to do, she said finally, but I'm not someone you can just pursue because I tripped into you. His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't look away. You think I go after women like this often? I think men like you don't usually ask. Another pause, then he leaned in, just slightly, close enough that she could feel his breath, but far enough to keep the tension in place. I don't chase, he said calmly, but I am persistent. Ava's heart thudded. She stood abruptly. I should go. Ethan didn't stop her, but his voice followed her as she walked away. Ava. She turned slowly. He met her eyes and said simply, You have more effect on people than you realize. And just like that, he turned back to the bar, leaving her standing in a sea of strangers, shaken by something that felt far more dangerous than a spilled glass of wine. The ballroom had transformed. What earlier buzzed with introductions and champagne clinks now glowed under a canopy of golden lights, casting a warm, intimate shimmer over everything. The music had softened jazz now, rich and smooth, guiding couples to the dance floor one by one, as if the night itself had decided it was time for closeness. Ava lingered near a column draped in soft white fabric and tiny twinkling bulbs. She kept a glass of sparkling water in hand, pretending to sip, pretending not to feel what she felt. But she couldn't pretend she didn't notice when Ethan Carter stepped onto the dance floor. He wasn't dancing. He was observing, standing at the edge of the crowd, tall and composed in his now wine-stained suit, though somehow still impeccable. He scanned the room with the kind of calm assurance that only men like him carried, powerful, unshaken, selective. Ava's breath caught when his gaze landed on her again. This time, there was no crowd between them, no staircase, no awkward accident to blame, just the quiet possibility of something neither of them fully understood. He took one step toward her, then another, and she could have walked away. She could have slipped into the bathroom, out to the balcony, even vanished into the elevator, but she didn't move. Ethan stopped in front of her with the same ease he might negotiate a billion-dollar deal, then extended his hand with quiet confidence. Dance with me, he said. Not a question, not a plea, but not a command either. It was a request, a rare one. Ava stared at his hand, her heart pounded. Her first instinct was to refuse, to shake her head, and hide behind another clever remark, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he waited, not pushing, not charming, just present. Or maybe it was the part of her that was tired of running, from connection, from risk, from him. She set her glass down and slipped her fingers into his hand. His touch was warm, strong, certain. He led her slowly to the floor through soft shadows and low murmurs until they were surrounded by other couples, swaying gently to the music. And then he turned toward her, placed his hand carefully on her waist, and guided her into the rhythm. The first steps were tentative. Ava kept her eyes lowered, focused on not stepping on his shoes. Her body stiff with nerves, but Ethan moved easily, naturally, as if he had danced 1,000 times before, but never like this. "Relax," he murmured, voice low near her ear. "I won't let you fall." That made her look up, their eyes locked, and suddenly, the room fell away. The chandeliers, the music, the hum of voices, none of it mattered. There was only his hand on her waist, his fingers grazing hers, the subtle scent of his cologne, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in a world full of distractions. They didn't speak. Not for a long time. There was something sacred about the silence. It wasn't awkward. It was charged, like their bodies were speaking a language too ancient for words. Every sway, every breath, every inch of space between them hummed with questions they hadn't dared ask. "Who are you beneath all that calm? Why do I feel like I've known you longer than this room has existed? Why does this feel like a beginning I never saw coming?" Ava felt herself soften, her shoulders relaxed, her breath deepened, her steps aligned more naturally with his. She let herself be led, not out of submission, but out of trust, tentative, unfamiliar trust. He didn't smirk. He didn't flirt. He simply watched her, not like a man used to taking, but like a man who wanted to see, and being seen, truly seen, was something Ava hadn't felt in a long, long time. He leaned in slightly, voice almost a whisper. "You surprise me." She looked up. "Why?" Ethan's eyes searched hers. "Unguarded, because you're not trying." "Trying what?" "To impress me, to win, to control the conversation. Most people do." Ava felt her throat tighten, emotions stirring in places she'd kept locked. "I don't want to impress you," she said honestly. "I don't even know what this is." He didn't flinch. "Neither do I." And somehow, that made her feel safer than any line ever could. They danced in silence again, the song blending into another. His hand shifted slightly on her back, closer, warmer. Her body responded involuntarily, drawn to the heat, to the quiet intensity of his presence. It wasn't lust, not exactly. It was something deeper, a pull, a recognition, like two people who had stood on opposite sides of the same question their whole lives, and suddenly found the answer walking toward them in a borrowed dress and a black suit. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, let herself feel it, let the music blur into the rhythm of her breath, let the fear slip just enough for one step to follow another. And when she opened them again, Ethan was still there, watching her like she was a page he hadn't dared read until now. "Why did you really come talk to me?" she asked quietly. He paused, then said without hesitation, "Because you didn't belong here, and somehow you fit more than anyone else." Ava's breath caught. She didn't respond, couldn't, and maybe he didn't expect her to, because, in the next moment, the music faded, and the lights dimmed further as the band prepared for the next set. The crowd shifted. Applause rose gently, but neither of them moved. They just stood there, still holding each other, as if the rest of the world could wait, as if this dance wasn't over, as if something was beginning slowly, quietly, undeniably, and neither of them was ready to let go. The night had deepened into that quiet, elegant hour when the music slowed, the laughter faded into murmurs, and the last of the champagne sparkled untouched in half-filled glasses. Most guests had drifted away, some toward elevators, others slipping into black cars that waited like shadows outside the marble entrance of the Whitmore Hotel. Ava stepped out into the chilled New York night air, wrapping her arms around herself. The warmth of the ballroom still lingered on her skin, but inside her chest, a different heat simmered, quiet, nervous, disorienting. She checked her phone, still dead, of course. She walked toward the valet stand, searching for any sign of available rides. Nothing. A sea of sleek town cars had vanished into the city, swallowed by midnight. A voice behind her cut through the silence like velvet against glass. "Need a ride?" She turned. Ethan stood a few steps away, his coat already on, his tie slightly loosened. The controlled corporate perfection of earlier had softened. He looked almost human, still powerful, still untouchable, but less like a statue, more like a man. "Ava hesitated. I'll call a car." "You can't. I'll figure it out. Your phone's dead." She narrowed her eyes. "You were watching me." He didn't flinch. "I was paying attention." She should have been angry. She should have walked away. But the truth was, he was right, and worse, a part of her didn't want to be alone just yet, not after the way he'd held her on the dance floor, not after the way his silence had spoken louder than the music. Ethan stepped closer. "Let me drive you. I didn't think you drove yourself anywhere." "I don't." She raised a brow. But tonight, he added, his voice lower, felt different. Ava stared at him for a beat too long, then sighed. Fine, she said, but only because it's freezing. He gave a half smile. Of course, the ride was silent at first, not the awkward kind, the charged kind. Ethan drove a sleek black Maserati, smooth, quiet, intimidating, like everything else about him. The city glowed outside the windows, blurred by the soft fog of late-night humidity. Neon signs flickered across the windshield. Streetlights passed overhead in rhythmic pulses. Ava sat straight, hands in her lap, eyes forward. He didn't glance at her. Not once. She wondered if the tension she felt was only hers. Then he spoke. You don't let people in easily, do you? She blinked. Excuse me? You guard yourself with wit, distance, like armor. She turned her head, brows slightly raised. And you analyze all your passengers like this? Only the ones who leave before the song ends. Ava exhaled a laugh that wasn't entirely amused. Maybe I just don't enjoy being predictable. Good, he said. Predictable bordesme. She looked out the window again. You're used to getting what you want. I'm used to people pretending I'm what they want. That made her pause. She turned to face him again. Slower this time. And what about you? What do you want? For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said simply, clarity. That's a strange word for a man like you. I live in a world built on lies, Ava deals, masks, power plays. People say things they don't mean and mean things they never say. His voice darkened slightly. So, when I see someone who doesn't know how to pretend, I notice. Ava swallowed. She wasn't sure whether to be flattered or exposed. Maybe I am pretending, she said, more to herself than him. I don't think you are. They stopped at a red light. The city outside was still alive. Cars passing, horns echoing faintly in the distance. But inside the car, time stretched. She turned to look at him fully now. His profile in the dim dashboard light was all sharp lines and quiet intensity. But something in his jaw had softened. He glanced at her. You're not like them. Who? The ones who chase approval, or position, or money. He paused. You lead with something else. Ava didn't answer because she didn't know how. Because maybe he wasn't wrong. He drove a little farther, then asked, do you believe in instinct? She frowned slightly. What kind? The kind that tells you something matters before you can explain why. Ava hesitated. I believe in patterns, in reading people, in moments that feel different. She glanced at him. But I also believe those moments can lie. Ethan nodded slowly. So you don't trust what you feel, not if it shows up out of nowhere. And yet, he said, pulling the car to a gentle stop. Here you are. Ava looked out the window. They were in front of her apartment building. She hadn't even noticed the ride passing. He turned off the engine but didn't move. Just rested his hands on the steering wheel, gaze forward, voice calm. You don't owe me anything. And I'm not asking for anything. Ava waited. But I'll say this, he continued. People spend their whole lives pretending to feel things. You and I, we're doing the opposite. We feel something, and we're pretending not to. That struck a nerve. She reached for the door handle but didn't open it. Why me? She whispered. He turned to face her now, fully. His voice dropped. Because you walked into a room full of people who belong and made the whole place feel new. Ava felt the words like warmth in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to respond. So, instead, she opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Her heels clicked softly on the sidewalk, but just before she closed the door, she looked back. Ethan was still watching her, still calm, still patient. And in the quiet between them, she realized he wasn't chasing her. He was waiting. And that, somehow, was even more dangerous. Monday mornings always had a particular texture, dense, slightly disoriented, like the city was still waking up beneath its coat of ambition. Ava Bennett entered the glass lobby of Horizon Architecture with her coffee in hand and the ghost of Saturday night still clinging to her skin. She hadn't slept well, not because she was tired, but because her mind kept replaying fragments of a car ride, a dance, a voice in the dark. You have more effect on people than you realize. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was nothing, a moment inflated by music, wine, and moonlight. But something about the way Ethan had looked at her, talked to her, unsettled her deeper than she wanted to admit. Now it was Monday, and in Monday's world, there was no room for confusion, only precision, deadlines, blueprints. Ava took a deep breath as she stepped into the elevator. The steel doors closed with a soft hiss, and her reflection stared back at her, composed, professional, perfectly curated, just as she needed to be. By the time she reached the 19th floor, she was ready, or so she thought. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm phones ringing, footsteps clicking across polished concrete. Designers hunched over CAD screens and foam models. Ava greeted a few colleagues, checked her calendar, and headed to the main conference room for the weekly project briefing. The Richmond Tower account, biggest project of the quarter. She entered the room mid-conversation. Her team was already seated, folders open, architectural drawings spread across the table. "Ava," said Tom, "the firm's director of development. Perfect timing. Have a seat. We're just about to begin." She nodded and slipped into a chair, flipping open her notepad, and then the door opened behind her. "Morning," said a calm, familiar voice. "Herr Pien stopped?" No, it couldn't be, but it was. Ava turned her head, and there he stood, Ethan Carter, in a crisp gray suit, no wine stains, no shadows of Saturday. His expression was neutral, unreadable. His eyes scanned the room as if this were any other meeting, any other Monday. Her breath caught in her throat. "Team, I'd like to formally introduce Ethan Carter," Tom continued, completely unaware of the silent earthquake happening inside her. "He's now the lead investor on the Richmond Tower project. He'll be working closely with us, moving forward." Ava blinked. Ethan nodded to the room, calm as ever. "Pleasure to meet you all. I've been following your progress for months, and I'm impressed. I'm looking forward to collaborating." His eyes didn't move toward her, not once. He spoke with professionalism, clarity, the perfect blend of authority and approachability, as if she didn't exist, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't told her she was different. Ava felt her skin prickle with disbelief, and something else, anger, embarrassment. She wasn't sure, but the shift in the air was unmistakable. He'd changed the rules again. Tom continued speaking, but she barely heard him. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She kept her eyes on her notes, trying to breathe normally, to act normally. She couldn't, because now Ethan Carter was sitting across the table, directly across, and finally, for the briefest moment, his eyes met hers, expressionless, controlled. But the silence that passed between them screamed. After the meeting, the team scattered quickly. Ava stood last, organizing her papers with forced calm. Ethan lingered, speaking with Tom by the window. She turned to leave. "Ava," he said without turning around. "A moment?" She froze. Tom gave her a polite smile. "I'll leave you two." When they were alone, Ava closed the door behind him slowly. Ethan didn't speak immediately. She folded her arms. "So that's why you knew everything about me." He turned to face her. "I didn't lie. You omitted. I didn't want to influence the conversation." She scoffed. "You mean you wanted to see how much I'd reveal without knowing who you were?" His expression didn't waver. "I wanted honesty, not performance." Ava stepped closer, voice low. "You think walking into my office like that doesn't change everything? I think pretending nothing happened changes more." There it was again, that calm, unnerving clarity, the way he made her feel like she was the only one flinching, the only one feeling. She shook her head. "You should have said something, given me a warning. I didn't plan it this way. But you let it happen." He met her eyes then, finally, and the mask cracked just enough. "I wanted to see if what I felt that night was real, or if it would disappear by Monday." Ava's throat tightened. "And did it?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. The tension between them was thick now, heavier than wine, heavier than music or dance or even memory. It was now real, professional, complicated. "This isn't going to work," she said, more to herself than him. "Why?" "Because I can't think straight when you're in the room." Ethan took a slow breath, then said, "Good, then we're on equal ground." She stared at him. He turned, walked to the door, and paused before opening it. "I won't cross any lines," he said without looking back, "but I also won't pretend they don't exist." And with that, he was gone, leaving Ava in a silent room, her world freshly turned upside down again. The following days unfolded like a carefully rehearsed performance, scripts memorized, lines delivered, and emotions folded neatly beneath crisp blouses and tailored suits. On the surface, everything at Horizon Architecture remained professional, except Ava's pulse. It betrayed her every time she stepped into a room where Ethan Carter was present. She'd expected him to stay distant, to let the tension dissolve on its own. Instead, he did the opposite. He inserted himself into every meeting related to the Richmond Tower with calm authority and a faint smirk that only she seemed to notice. He didn't flirt, didn't touch her, didn't even speak to her directly outside of work matters. but the way he watched her attentively, quietly, like a man observing a storm from behind glass, undermined every effort she made to act unaffected, and worse, he challenged her at every turn. It started subtly. During a design meeting, Ava presented her vision for the lobby's atrium: bold skylights, suspended gardens, natural textures. She'd spent weeks refining it. Ethan sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The concept is beautiful," he said, voice even, "but how will the acoustics hold up during peak hours? With that many reflective surfaces, won't the noise overwhelm the space?" Ava blinked. "We've accounted for that, with acoustic panels behind the wood veneer." He nodded slowly. "I'd like to see data on sound diffusion, simulations, numbers." Her jaw tightened. "Of course." He gave her a polite nod, then turned to the others. "Continue." The meeting moved on, but the damage lingered. Ava wasn't upset because he questioned her work. She was upset because he was right, and because he knew exactly how to push without crossing the line. In private, it continued. He'd pass her in the hallway, just close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, just long enough for her perfume to mix with his cologne in the air between them. Once, he brushed his hand across her lower back as he moved behind her at the coffee station. So lightly she could have imagined it, but she hadn't, and he knew it. They spoke like professionals, addressed each other by last names in meetings, but outside those walls, in the silence between exchanged glances, in the space of a shared elevator, they were something else. A storm held back by glass. On Wednesday, it snapped. They were alone in the design lab, going over blueprint mock-ups late into the evening. The office was mostly empty. The city outside bathed in soft gold and steel blue. Ava stood over the plans, marker in hand, tracing adjustments. Ethan leaned against the opposite table, arms crossed, watching her. "You're avoiding the mezzanine question," he said quietly. "I'm prioritizing the base structure." She replied without looking up. "The mezzanine is critical to the flow between levels. We'll integrate it once the main supports are resolved." "You're delaying." Ava snapped her head toward him. "I'm strategizing." A pause. Then, in a voice far too calm, "Do you always take things personally when someone challenges you?" She stepped forward. "Do you always test people just to see how far they'll bend before they snap?" Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. "You're different with me," he said. Her breath caught. "You think that's a compliment?" "It's a fact." She narrowed her eyes. "Well, maybe you bring out the worst in me, or the real." The silence between them thickened. It wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal. It had shifted somewhere along the line from tension to something more combustible. Ava looked at him, searching for the crack beneath his calm, for any sign of the man who had held her hand during a slow dance, who had whispered things no man ever dared say to her, but all she saw now was control, steel, and something underneath waiting to break. She grabbed her notebook. "This is not going to work." "What isn't this project?" "Us. Like this." Ethan stepped forward slowly. "So, what do you want to do, Ava? Pretend none of it happened?" "Yes." She snapped. "Liar." Her eyes flared. He stopped. Close enough now that she could see the storm behind his gaze. "I've worked with the best," he said, voice low. "But you're not just talented, you're driven, and for some reason, you keep trying to convince yourself that wanting me is a flaw you need to fix." Ava stared at him. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say that. It's the truth." "No, it's a game." He leaned in, not touching, but close enough to ignite the air. "Then why haven't you walked away?" She had no answer. Her breath was unsteady, her chest tight. She wanted to scream, to leave, to pull him to her, and hated that all those urges came at once. She turned on her heel. "I need space," she muttered. Ethan didn't stop her this time, but as she walked out of the room, her heels clicking across the tile, she heard him say, just loud enough for her to catch, "You're the one who walked into my world, Ava, but now you're the only part of it I can't control." That night, Ava lay awake in bed, her mind circling everything he'd said, everything she hadn't. The truth was, he was right, and that terrified her more than she could admit. It started with an email. Subject: Richmond Tower Design. Brief dinner. No pleasantries. No emojis. Just the kind of direct message Ethan Carter was known for. Ava stared at her screen longer than she should have, rereading the time and location twice, as if trying to decode what wasn't written. Dinner. A work dinner. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could refuse, say she was busy, suggest a Zoom call instead, but she didn't. Instead, she replied with a single word. Confirmed. The restaurant wasn't what she expected. She'd braced for a sleek, exclusive place with minimalist decor, dim lighting, and overpriced silence. But instead, Ethan had chosen a small Italian spot tucked between two brownstones in the West Village, warm lights glowing through fogged windows, the scent of roasted garlic and fresh basil spilling onto the sidewalk. She arrived first, her coat damp from the misty air, hair pinned in a way that felt both professional and like she hadn't overthought it. Even though she had, he walked in 5 minutes later. No driver, no entourage, just him, a gray wool coat, sleeves pushed halfway up his forearms, collar loosened. Casual for once. Almost vulnerable, their eyes met across the room, and that moment silent still lasted just long enough to make her forget where she was. Ethan walked to the table and offered a slight smile. Thanks for coming. Ava lifted a brow, like I had a choice. He didn't deny it, just sat down and unfolded his napkin with quiet grace. The waiter brought water, menus. They ordered bruschetta and wine without looking at each other too much. Silence settled between them, not cold, just careful. He was the first to break it. I chose this place because they don't know my name here. Avatildeha Hill. That happens often? Too often. He took a sip of wine. I wanted to speak to you, without the world watching. Ava's chest tightened. About the project? His eyes flicked to hers. Among other things. A pause. Then she leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. Why me, Ethan? It came out sharper than she meant, but she didn't take it back. He didn't blink. Because you don't try to impress me. That's not an answer. It's part of one. She waited. He exhaled slowly. You see things most people miss, not just in buildings, in people, in me. His voice dropped. And that makes me uncomfortable. Ava looked away. She felt that weight in her chest again, the one that pressed in when he spoke like this, too honest, too close. Maybe I don't want to see you, she said softly. Then why haven't you walked away? She opened her mouth, closed it again. He nodded slowly. Exactly. The food arrived. They ate in relative silence. The clink of silverware grounding the moment. Ava surprised herself by relaxing slightly. There was something disarming about seeing him here, without the boardroom armor, without the calculated detachment. Here Ethan Carter was just a man, a brilliant, complicated, maddening man, but still human. After dinner, he surprised her again. I want to show you something. She hesitated. Is this still part of the project? In a way. He paid the bill without fanfare, then led her through the quiet streets. Coat shielding her from the drizzle, they walked 3 blocks in silence until he stopped in front of a gated property. It was an old theater, abandoned, covered in ivy and faded posters. Ava looked at him, puzzled. This was the first place I ever felt anything, Ethan said. She turned to face him fully now. What do you mean? I was 12. My father had just bought it, planning to tear it down. But for some reason, he brought me inside before the demolition. He smiled faintly. There were still red velvet seats, chandeliers. The stage creaked when I walked across it. But I remember standing there and thinking, this mattered to someone. Ava was quiet. He continued, voice distant. That's when I started noticing things others didn't. The weight of a room, the light through a broken window, the stories that don't make it into blueprints. She was stunned not because of what he said, but because of how he said it raw, untouched. Why are you telling me this? He looked at her. Because no one else ever asked. Ava swallowed hard. The air between them shifted. Something softened. Something surrendered. And she realized this wasn't a man who avoided feeling. This was a man who never had permission to feel until now. They walked a little longer, their footsteps sinking on wet pavement. Back at her building, she hesitated on the sidewalk. Thank you, she said. For what? For not being who I thought you were. He stepped closer, not touching, just near enough for the warmth to rise between them again. You're changing things, Ava. She felt the words all the way to her spine. I'm not trying to. I know, he said softly. That's why it's working. A beat of silence. Then she smiled, gentle and real. Good night, Ethan. He didn't try to kiss her, didn't reach for her hand, but as she turned to go, he said. Ava glanced over her shoulder. No, she said. I'll just see more. And then she walked inside, heart full, thoughts spiraling, already wondering what tomorrow would dare bring. There was a stillness in the city that night, the kind of quiet that only came when everything slowed just enough to hear your own heartbeat. The rain had faded into mist, and the skyline gleamed like glass under a silver moon. Ava stood by her window, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the soft glow of the streetlights below. The night air filtered in gently through the open window, cool against her bare shoulders. She hadn't expected him to call, but he had not with an excuse, not with pressure, just a voice on the other end of the line, low and calm. "I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know where this leads, and I won't ask you for more than you can give. But tonight, if you need truth, I'm here." She didn't answer right away. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no. And now, standing there, she wasn't sure if she was trembling from the breeze or from the storm building inside her. There was a knock, soft, measured. Ava turned slowly. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She opened the door, and there he was. Ethan, still in his dark suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons undone. His hair was slightly damp from the mist, and there was something unguarded in his eyes. Something stripped of power and strategy. He looked at her like a man who had surrendered every shield. And she wasn't ready. But she stepped aside. He entered without a word, and for a moment, they just stood there, no distance, no rehearsed lines. Just 2 people caught in something neither of them had planned. Ava broke the silence first. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Ethan met her eyes. "Neither do I." She walked slowly to the center of the room, her voice tight. "You make everything confusing. I hate that you get in my head, that I can't focus, that when you're near, I feel like I'm losing parts of myself I spent years building." He followed her, each step slow, measured, but his voice low, steady. "You're not losing anything, Ava. You're remembering." She looked at him sharply. "Remembering what?" "How it feels to be seen, not for your work, not for what you fix, but for you." Her breath trembled, and then she whispered the question that had haunted her for days. "Why me?" He stepped closer now, the space between them vanishing. "Because you don't let me hide," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I've been hiding for a long time." Ava's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. They stood in silence, heartbeats filling the room like a second presence. And then, slowly, Ethan reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a second too long. She closed her eyes. His hand dropped, but the distance stayed gone. "I don't want a promise," she said. "I'm not offering one," he replied. "I don't want to regret this." "You won't. I don't trust easily." "Then don't trust me. Just feel this." She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't run. She stepped into him slowly. Her fingers touched his chest first, resting just over his heart. She felt its rhythm steady, solid, real. He didn't move, didn't pull her closer. He let her choose, and she did. Her hands slid up to his shoulders, her lips just inches from his. Her breath mingled with his in the space that remained. Then she whispered, "Close the window." Ethan didn't ask why. He turned, walked to the window, and shut it gently, the click echoing in the quiet room. When he turned back, she was still there, still watching him. And then, finally, he crossed the floor in 2 long strides and pulled her into him, not harsh, not rushed, but as if he'd been waiting to hold her for years. Their lips met, soft at first, exploratory. Then deeper, real, like something sacred that had long been denied. Ava clung to his jacket, and Ethan pressed a hand to the small of her back, grounding her as the kiss deepened. There were no games, no tactics, just emotion rising like tidewater between them, slow and unstoppable. Clothes didn't fall away in a rush. They were removed carefully, like pages of a story too important to tear. He kissed the curve of her neck, the inside of her wrist, the place just beneath her collarbone. She gasped softly, and he paused, watching her reaction like every movement mattered. And it did, because this wasn't about desire alone. It was about choice. And tonight, Ava chose. She chose to stop running, to stop pretending, to feel. Their bodies came together like puzzle pieces that had always fit, but had never dared touch. And when they collapsed beneath the sheets, breathless and shaken, it wasn't lust that filled the silence. It was the weight of everything unspoken, everything real. The next morning, the sunlight poured into the room like an intruder. Ava stirred slowly, the warmth of the bed still clinging to her skin. She reached for the edge of the sheet, then sat up slightly. Ethan was already awake, dressed, standing by the window, his back to her. The silence wasn't cold, but it was different. Ava wrapped the sheet around herself and walked to him. "You're leaving?" He nodded once. "I have meetings." "Of course," he did, She waited for something else, a look, a word, a reassurance, but all he said was, "Last night wasn't a mistake." Ava swallowed, then said, almost too softly, "But what comes next?" Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said. "Do you?" She didn't answer, because the truth was, she wasn't sure either. The days that followed blurred into one another like pages in a book she wasn't ready to finish. Ava moved through her routine like a ghost coffee, blueprints, presentations, wearing calm like armor. No one at Horizon Architecture would have guessed what had shifted inside her, not by her posture, not by her tone, but Ethan knew, and that made it worse, because he said nothing. No late-night messages, no unexpected phone calls, no stolen glances in the conference room. He was professional, focused, almost distant. Ava told herself that's what she wanted, that it was the smart thing, that the space he gave her was a sign of respect, but it didn't feel like space. It felt like silence, and silence, when it followed something that had once burned like fire, felt crueler than rejection. The final investor meeting for Richmond Tower was set for Friday morning. Everything had to be perfect, designs locked, proposals printed, data visualized. Ava had worked late every night to polish the last details. It was the biggest project of her career, the culmination of everything she'd fought for, and yet, she couldn't focus. Every time she reviewed the presentation, her mind drifted to him, to the way he touched her, to the way he'd walked away that morning without a promise, to the way he hadn't reached out since. She hated that she noticed. She hated even more that it mattered. On Thursday evening, she found him in the boardroom alone, reviewing documents in the soft golden light of the city skyline beyond the glass walls. She didn't knock. She stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her. Ethan looked up, surprised, but only for a moment. Then his expression settled back into something unreadable. "I need to ask you something," Ava said, her voice low. He nodded. "Go ahead." She didn't speak right away. Then, "Are we just pretending now?" Ethan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "How you said it wasn't a mistake," she continued, taking a step closer, "but you've treated it like it was ever since." "I've respected your space," he said. "That's not space, Ethan. That's absence." He looked away. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, louder with every second. "I can't do this," she whispered. "This half-state, this pretending we're just colleagues when we both know we crossed that line." Ethan folded his arms. "And what do you want me to do, Ava? Announce it in a team memo? Complicate your career with whispers and politics? I want you to feel something," she snapped. "I want to know it mattered to you, that I wasn't just a moment you let happen because you were curious." His silence was worse than a denial. She stepped back, pain rising like a tide. "This is why people don't get close to you," she said, "because you make them feel like they're standing at the edge of something, and the moment they step forward, you disappear." Ethan's voice was quiet. "And you run every time something feels real." Ava flinched. They stared at each other, both breathing hard, both aching, and then Ethan did something unexpected. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a signed document, and placed it on the table between them. Ava stepped closer. It was a full transfer of his shares in the Richmond Tower project. Her name was listed as lead stakeholder. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" "I'm removing myself from the project," he said, effective immediately. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "This was never about control," he added. "It was about being near you. But if being near me is what's stopping you from being fully you, then I won't be the thing that stands in your way." Ava's voice cracked. "You can't just walk away." "I'm not walking," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'm letting go." She felt the words like a punch to the chest, because, beneath all her defenses, behind the walls she'd built, she didn't want him to let go. But she also didn't know how to ask him to stay. Tears welled in her eye. She hated them. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied. "But we found it anyway." A silence followed. One, heavier than anything they'd said, and then Ethan picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. He paused beside her, just long enough for their shoulders to brush, and then, without looking back, he said quietly, "If I stay, you'll keep running. If I leave, maybe you'll stop." And then he was gone. The room felt too quiet, too wide, and Ava stood there, heart shattering under the weight of everything she had tried not to feel. 3 days. That's how long it had been since Ethan walked away. 3 days since Ava sat in the empty boardroom, staring at a piece of paper that symbolized not only the end of a project, but something far more personal. She had read and reread the document, memorized the weight of his signature, the firm strokes of his name, the quiet finality it carried, but it wasn't the contract that haunted her. It was his silence. No calls, no emails, no accidental run-ins. She didn't know where he was, and that absence hurt more than his presence ever had. The office moved on. Richmond Tower was now fully under Horizon's leadership, and Ava, on paper, was thriving. Colleagues praised her, clients applauded her, but inside, she was unraveling. Because the truth she hadn't said aloud that day in the boardroom was now echoing in every silent moment. She didn't want him to go. Sunday afternoon, the city breathed slow and gray. A soft drizzle coated the streets like a whisper, and Ava found herself walking nowhere in particular. Her umbrella hung loosely at her side, unopened, forgotten. Memories of him clung to the city's corners, the coffee shop near the office, where he'd once stood too close behind her in line, the restaurant where they'd sat too long, saying too little, the gated theater he'd shown her, where his voice had cracked with something real. Everything reminded her of Ethan, and everything she hadn't said. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Lila. Ava answered quickly. "Please tell me you're home," Lila said. No greeting, just breathless urgency, because someone is standing outside your building like he's waiting for a miracle. Ava's breath stopped. "What?" "I just passed by umbrella in one hand, grocery bag in the other, and then I saw him, just standing there. No coat, no umbrella, just pacing like he's rehearsing a speech he doesn't know how to finish." Ava didn't even respond. She ran. The rain turned into mist as she rounded the corner to her street, her boots splashing against shallow puddles, her hair sticking to her cheeks. And then she saw him, Ethan, standing beneath the awning of her building, soaked, still, quiet. And when he saw her, his breath caught, like he hadn't been sure she would come. She slowed to a walk. He stepped forward. Neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he said it. "I was wrong." Ava blinked, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Ethan took another step. "I told myself I was doing the right thing, that leaving would give you space, that disappearing would make it easier for you to move on. But I was wrong." He searched her eyes. "I haven't slept. I haven't worked. I haven't done anything right since I left. Because every time I close my eyes, I see your face, and every time I try to move on, I hear your voice asking why I didn't fight harder." Ava's lips parted. "I never asked that." He smiled, faint, broken. "You didn't have to." The silence between them pulsed with meaning. Ethan continued, his voice raw. "I've spent my whole life building walls, creating systems, controlling every variable. And then you walked in late, chaotic, stubborn, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore." He stepped closer again. "I thought I could walk away from you, that I could bury this feeling like I've buried everything else that scared me." A pause. "But I can't." Ava swallowed hard. He looked at her with no mask, no pride. Just a man stripped down to the one truth he could no longer hide. "I'm in love with you." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was real, honest, and it shattered something in her. Because she had waited. Waited for those words to come from someone who meant them. And now that they had, the walls she'd spent years building cracked wide open. Ava's voice trembled. "Do you mean it?" "I've never been more certain of anything." Her eyes filled. She tried to speak, but no words came, only a breath, shaky and full of everything. She hadn't let herself feel. He held out his hand. "Say something," he whispered. She stepped forward slowly, water dripping from her coat, her hair plastered to her cheeks. "I've spent days pretending I didn't need you," she said, voice low, telling myself that walking away was strength, that silence was peace. She looked up, tears now falling freely. "But the truth is, I haven't felt alive since you left that room." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. She was already in his arms. Their lips met not with fire, not with urgency, but with the kind of ache that only comes when two people finally stop lying to themselves. He held her tightly. She buried her face in his chest, the rain forgotten. And for the first time, there were no questions, no conditions, just truth. Just them. They stood there long after the world around them resumed, cars passing, lights flickering on behind windows, the city returning to its rhythm. But for Ava and Ethan, time had stopped, and neither of them was ready to move again. Time passed not in sudden leaps or dramatic turns, but in quiet, steady rhythms, like the ticking of a clock no one really hears until everything else falls silent. For Ava and Ethan, The days after that rainy reunion became something sacred, not because they were flawless, but because they were real. They learned each other in fragments, not just favorite foods or childhood memories, but fears, silences, the way she chewed her lip when deep in thought, the way he touched the edge of his watch when nervous, the way neither of them had ever truly belonged to anyone before. Ethan no longer needed to be in control, and Ava no longer needed to run. They weren't trying to be perfect, they were just present. 3 months later, on a Friday evening, when the city pulsed with spring warmth and the skyline shimmered gold, Ethan invited her to dinner, not just any dinner. He'd planned it himself. No assistants, no grand team, just a private terrace above the skyline of Manhattan, with candles flickering on every ledge, string lights overhead, and soft jazz echoing from an old record player. When Ava stepped out of the elevator, her breath caught. He was waiting there, hands in his pockets, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. She took slow steps toward him, her heels clicking on the stone floor, the fabric of her dress floating around her knees. "You did all this?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "I had help." She grinned. "Lila." Of course. They sat and laughed. There were no heavy declarations, no rehearsed speeches, just warmth, glances, the quiet familiarity of two people who had finally stopped fighting what was always meant to be. After dessert, something chocolate and unnecessarily decadent, Ethan stood. "I want to show you something." He held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. He led her to the edge of the terrace, where the skyline stretched like a painting behind them. The breeze kissed her shoulders. The city breathed beneath their feet. And then, slowly, Ethan turned to her. Ava froze, because in that moment, she knew. He dropped to one knee, no dramatic gasps, no music swell, just that soft, steady look in his eyes, the one that always saw her, always waited for her to catch up. "I've built towers," he said, voice quiet. "Closed deals, won. Every kind of battle they told me mattered, but none of it made sense until I met you." Eva blinked, her hands trembling. "You made me human again. You made me feel, and you made me want a life I never believed I deserved." He reached into his pocket, revealed a simple, elegant ring, platinum, a single diamond, no glittering noise, just meaning, "Marry me, Ava Bennett." She didn't cry right away. She just smiled, the kind of smile that only comes when your soul recognizes home. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, firmer. "Yes." 1,000 times. "Yes." He stood, slid the ring on her finger, and pulled her into a kiss that melted every scar they'd once carried. Above them, the city kept spinning, but in that moment, it felt like the world had paused, just long enough for two hearts to choose each other completely. 6 months later, the wedding wasn't extravagant. It wasn't about guests or appearances. It was about them, a garden ceremony at sunset, Lila beaming beside Ava, Tom wiping his eyes like he wasn't crying, and Ethan, standing at the altar in a dark navy suit, hands steady, heart open. When Ava walked down the aisle, the wind caught the veil just enough to make it dance. Her father held her arm, but it was Ethan's eyes she searched for. And when their hands finally met again, everything else fell away. The vows were written by hand, spoken slowly, meant fully. And when Ethan said, "I will choose you every day without needing to understand every piece of you, only needing to love you," there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Ava replied with a smile that trembled slightly, then said, "And I will never run again, because now I know home isn't a place, it's a person, and that person is you." They kissed the kind of kiss that sealed stories, not just promises, and the applause felt distant, like background music to something far more intimate. Afterward, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and amber, they slipped away from the crowd, just the two of them, walking hand in hand across the garden lawn, barefoot, laughing. "I never imagined this," Ava whispered. Ethan glanced at her. "Imagined what?" "That the man who once terrified me with his silence would be the one who taught me how to listen to my own heart." He pulled her close, arms wrapping around her from behind. "And I never imagined the woman who crashed into me would rebuild everything I thought I knew about love." They stood there, silent again, but this time there was no distance in it, only peace, only beginning. Because, in the end, resisting had been a form of love, loving had been a form of surrender, and surrendering had become the foundation of everything they now stood on together. Because sometimes, all someone needs is to be seen, truly seen. Amid the chaos and uncertainty, Ava and Ethan learned that resisting can be a form of love, but only through surrender can something real and lasting be built.